Well, welcome everybody to join us again at the Crosse Thinker Podcast. And today we have Dr. Ryan McKelley from the psychology department to talk about addictive technologies. So thank you for joining us. I know it's pretty late.
Hey, it's my pleasure. I appreciate it. I could talk about this stuff forever. So.
Oh, okay, that's great. So let's start with how do you define addictive technology, and why are you interested in doing this?
I'll start by answering the second part of the question.
Okay.
I didn't set out being interested in it too much from a content perspective, but several years ago at the American Psychological Association convention, they started bringing in kind of these thought leaders, in different fields. And I saw a title, something around that, maybe called Irresistible or something, about addictive technologies. And I got to see Adam Alter speak for about an hour and a half, and it was to a standing room only. I mean, it was crowded. He is a psychology, trained as a psychologist. He's a marketing professor at NYU, and he's got a TED Talk. So basically, the talk that he'd done at the convention was about how technology companies use some of the principles of psychology to get us hooked into these things. And I left that conference presentation just like blown away. Now, this was several years ago. This was before UWL was doing the first year seminar series. And I even had in the back of my head, is like, someday I want to teach this because I think it's an interesting topic. So that was probably the most recent push. But I would actually back up. Several years ago, probably about 8 or 9, I was doing clinical work here on campus. I led one of the groups I ran was a relationship support group. And so there were a lot of undergraduate students that were just talking about their romantic relationships here on campus and what was working and what wasn't. And I think at that time I was just really kind of surprised at what role technology was playing in navigating their relationships, and oftentimes what a barrier it was, but how they felt kind of just trapped in using that as a medium to communicate.
Can you elaborate on why that thing become a problem?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I remember being as an undergrad, and this was probably 20 years ago, kind of like you would hear the urban legend about somebody getting, dumped by their romantic partner with like a Post-it note. And I think that may have been a Seinfeld episode years ago or something. And here it was, people were talking about being dumped via text message. And it just got me thinking, we've got this technology that's, in many ways amazing, that allows us to communicate across distances and at any time. And yet it's now starting to be used to do some of these really kind of ancient human interaction, and it didn't sit right to me as a clinician or a human being, and nor did it seem to sit right with the students. But just felt like it's a lot easier to do it that way. And so it just made me think about what role, I think we can get swept up into the technology without always being mindful of how we're using it and whether we're using it in the ways that are most adaptive to us. And I always want to be clear, I am not anti-tech. My first career out of undergrad was at a giant tech consulting firm. And so I love technology. It's just, I think we've just kind of let some of it take a much bigger part of our lives than maybe anyone ever intended.
So can you actually elaborate on that? Like which part is occupying part of our life, which become addictive technology?
Yeah.
Go back to the first question.
Right. So back to the first question, and I mean, it's hard not to answer this in a somewhat clinical sense, because I know we throw the term addictive around, like, oh, that's addictive, and oh, this chocolate's great, I'm so addicted, right? But typically when we think about addictions, most people do think about substance or chemical addiction. So there's a couple of components to addiction or an addictive experience, and it's more and more use, so higher frequency of use over time, duration, so you're using whatever this is for longer periods of time. You've had some attempt, or you've tried multiple attempts to control your use, and you've been unsuccessful in controlling it. It gets to a point where it starts to impede or impact your ability to pursue some of life's life tasks, so job, school, relationship, sense of self. The patterns of use get to the point where you're spending more and more time seeking out that thing, whatever it is, and or recovering from the effects of it, like in the case of a substance. And if you put all these things together, that's usually what we're talking about when we talk from a clinical perspective about what addiction is. Now, some people have relationships to technology that approximate that and look very and feel very similar. I do want to be clear, though, in the diagnostic manual that I, kind of trained in as a psychologist, we don't have a term called technology addiction, although, people are researching it and people have argued, well, maybe we need to add that as a addictive disorder, because we do have gambling disorder as one. So again, it's not like it's there yet, but the patterns of use and people's struggles with them, anyway, they're there, and so oftentimes some of the ways that people go about trying to think about addictive technologies, looking at it through that lens that we understand other addictions.
So is it fair to me, to my understanding, to say that it's not phone is addictive, or like video game is technology addictive? It's more about, does it interfere with your normal life, and the duration, the impact, and basically all these things matters. Not just like a simple like this is bad, this is good. Right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And then you could take that one step further and say anything that we do has the potential to have that relationship to us. So people can have an unhealthy relationship to exercise. It can be food. It can be any number of things. So, and those are generally called behavioral addictions. So these behaviors that we get kind of trapped in and can't get out, and then they start to negatively impact our lives. So yeah, it's not like like Snapchat by default is a problem. But how it shows up in my life, and whether it's causing harm to myself and others and that kind of stuff, and same thing, video games. Plenty of people play plenty of video games without any, long-term harm to themselves or their lives. But it's the ones that cross that line and then are, failing in other expectations.
So if you're seeing things from the behavior level, seems like we're addicted to different things as time goes by, right? Older times we were addicted to something different. Now we just have some new thing to get addicted to. But is there anything different than this wave, like for technology, compared to other addictive, like gambling or drugs? Probably not too extreme, but yeah. Is there anything special about technology addictive?
Well, I'll go to, I don't know if you've seen Tristan Harris's TED Talk or any of the stuff. So Tristan Harris was a Google engineer,
Okay.
And almost kind of like a whistleblower after the fact. And so I think what he would explain is different now is now you've got teams of hundreds and thousands of engineers for some of these tech platforms with the sole purpose of trying to increase time on device, right? And so you now have the power of behavioral science, computer engineering, computer programming, and you've got some of these fields kind of coming together to say, how can I increase the possible time that you that fight for your attention, basically. And so I think that's what's different is you've got a lot of really motivated and driven and talented and smart people working together, and then if you add a profit motive to it, I think you've got a lot of incentive. No, that's not any different than designing a really good slot machine. I mean, that's that same kind of principle. Like let's use all the things that we know about psychology and variable reinforcement and all these types of things to kind of make this thing stickier and keep people putting money in longer. But that's now being applied to something on a grand scale, such as social media or apps and that kind of stuff.
That makes sense, because I recently listened to a podcast, and it's a big AI guy talking about, seems like everything is for free now, like Facebook, Snapchat, and everything. So the only thing we compete is not for the price. We compete for your attentions.
Absolutely.
And then it seems like if we can do live update, we can collect massive data from massive audience live and give live feedbacks, and we can see the preference of a massive proportion of the people. We can make adjustment right away, and we know that thing is going to work because it's live updated.
Yeah.
And it seems like the technology is actually, the business model actually is working against you instead of working with you.
Yes.
So they did have a big gathering actually recently in New York to talk about, can we have a different business model than this? Because of the scale and just because of the way we can do things so efficiently, that which had never happened before.
Yeah.
If you think about it, like marketing is almost like trying to manipulating people roughly
All right.
within psychological behaviors, but we never saw that thing as a problem because they didn't do such a good job.
That's true.
In certain kind of way. So
Right. Yeah, you had said something, and maybe you've heard this phrase, and I probably butchered a little bit, but it says, if a product is free, you are the product.
Yeah.
And so with technology, it's like, yeah, I got it. What's the big deal not spending all this money on this stuff? Well, it's because they're collecting so much information and be able to turn that on this like grand scale, and they're able to live test. I mean, that's the thing that fascinates me. I don't, people who don't follow this don't realize it, but even headlines or checking on clicks. I mean, they can test that stuff and see which of these is the most that causes the most outrage or the most interest, and then turn all of them into that headline. Or they could have 10 different headlines for the same article, but based on yours and my psychology. So like you said, at this massive scale, you have all this data that we have access to, and it's not that having that makes me any better at predicting what like you as an individual are going to do. But when you zoom out on a large scale, and we have a couple demographic stuff, I mean, there's a lot of info, and you can pull levers here and there to kind of direct people's attention, right, and try to keep it. And so, again, it's not on any one person, but at that scale, it's pretty powerful. Right?
So almost you're viewing the whole human being or human society as a big thing, and even you can just drive 10%. That involves millions of people, right?
Oh, absolutely. What was I going to say about that? Well, part of the other Tristan Harris thing is, on any given day, I mean, you could have 1 billion people on an app, at the same time. I mean, that's a huge set that you're collecting kind of live, and you can see what works here and what works there, and you're continuously refining it. I don't remember which company. It was either like Netflix or Google. Somebody said their biggest competitor, and it listed a couple of their tech companies, and then the third thing on the list was sleep. So they see sleep as a competitor, right? And so whatever we can do to get that lower part of your brainstem activated at those lower levels for you to get shift and keep attention here. And that, for some people who, for whatever reasons, those circumstances put them at risk for then getting, swept up into the addictive part of that experience and struggle to get out.
It's amazing you recommended me the textbook for the class, so I read it a little bit. It's actually very easy to manipulate people from neuroscience point of view and biological point of view. Just give you a light, give you a sound, you suddenly find yourself so much more motivated, right? It's just like you do the quiz, but every time you get the right answer, ding, you see a sound, suddenly you feel like, oh, I want to do it more.
Right.
Right, so that was interesting to see. Yeah. And I'm not saying human cannot resist that, but it will make it harder and harder for us to resist. You need a very strong will to resist that, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, and what I'll add, and we're all, even though I know this, kind of conceptually and scientifically, one thing that we know from psychology is that we tend to underestimate the influence of the context environment on our behavior, because we do, depending on where you are culturally in the world, certainly in the West, in the United States in particular, we have this kind of cultural norm towards free will and free choice, and we believe that we are in the ultimate, kind of control of our destinies, and we continuously underestimate the influence of all these other little things around us on very subtle behaviors. And so when you put it out at that scale, it's like we don't even know some of the time the things that influence us in subtle ways.
That's the whole public relationship is about, right? So you can start to build your avatars.
Right, absolutely. Yeah.
Interesting. So let's say this. We want to talk about addictive technology and how that's impact our life, right? The first thing I want to talk about is from the technology company side, and then the second part will be from our side. How do we actually adapt to this, right?
Yeah, sure.
So let's go from the tech company side. Do you feel like the company like Facebook and Google, now they have such access of daily massive data, they can start to do social experiments easily?
Oh, absolutely.
Right, and do you see this as a positive thing or bad thing? And also, where is the ethic in this?
That's a great question. But again, I don't think it's good or bad, right? It just is. Like the capabilities there, and I think it could be used for either or both. And I think it probably is, right? But we don't have any overarching ethical, community that sits there on top of these companies and says, should we do this social experiment? Is it okay to have somebody spending 24 hours on a live action role playing game? Like, is that an ethical thing to do, or should somebody turn that thing off at some point and let that person get some sleep and like feed their kid? I don't think we have that level of oversight, particularly with private companies. So again, I don't think it's good or bad that but it exists, and I think it takes somebody's will to use it for good, or at least to put their own brakes on it to stop it if it's going down the wrong path or an undesirable path. And at the same time, I think sometimes we learn this stuff after the fact. And so somebody might have good intentions. I mean, the like button on Facebook is a perfect example. I don't know if you remember, I was in grad school when Facebook came out, so I was able to get an account because I was a student. It was back when it was .edu. And that was before there was any of that kind of social component. It really was a lot of kind of just broadcast, share. And you had to kind of seek out and follow. I think they had some poke feature where you could poke people to kind of get their attention. But it wasn't until they put that like button on that really they saw this like rapid increase both in daily use and total users and everything else. That social reinforcement. So I think that's a good example of something that I think I think the intent was good, right? It's like, oh, I can say, hey, I see this. I think it's great. But now that same technology has replicated across all these other platforms, and people are, working really hard to either get those likes or those clicks, or on the flip side, they're having a lot of negative emotional experiences when it doesn't happen, right? And they're kind of chasing that, or they might even be amping up their behavior online. If this video didn't get it, well, let me try something else. So, it's had this, for some people, it's also then had this negative component to it. Even though on the front end, you might be like, oh, it's kind of this harmless little button. But that social reinforcement is such a motivator for humans.
Interesting, because we never experienced anything at this scale before.
Nope.
So it's almost feel like a second life, right? It's
Absolutely.
almost like, a different life, which we have no experience with.
Yep.
So from the company side, let's say if I want to be aware of some kind of the addictive component that may get me hooked up, is there any tricks I should especially pay attention? Like, hey, if I see this in the game, probably I should be wise when I play the game. Or when I see this app, like, for example, if I see a like button, I probably want to tell myself, like, do you really want to get into this?
Oh, so are you asking, though, like me as a consumer or a player, like what I should be mindful of? Or
Yeah, just what, as a consumer, what should we be mindful for? Like, if a company is trying to use this, probably that's the time I want to rethink, do I really want to use the product?
Like, gotcha.
Maybe it's not like it's bad. It's just like, for me, I'm very easily to be hooked to this.
Gotcha. So, one of the things, Alter had a whole chapter on it, this idea of the taking away the natural stopping points. And so, and I remember this, early version Netflix where I actually had to like get DVDs mailed to me, right? So before even streaming, there was a stopping cue there. Like when the DVD was over, I pulled out, movie was done, I went to bed or whatever, move on with my life. Then they started streaming. I see a movie, it's over, move on with my life. Then they realized, I think YouTube may have been the first to start playing the next video
Automatically.
And then then all these other providers started following suit. For me, that is a signal or an alarm that when the stopping cues have disappeared, that's probably a time to be like, wait a second, where's the natural end? Why am I not recognizing that as a natural end? And what used to be maybe a 23-minute show, I have now watched for an hour and a half, right? And I've lost
with 3 episodes,
right, back
non-stop.
to back. So I think as a consumer, it's starting to be mindful and paying attention to stopping cues, and then the lack of stopping cues. Another example with Instagram in its earlier days. When you got to the end of kind of the feed of the people you're connected to, like it ended, there was no more content. That's not the case anymore. And so a lot of those apps have just an endless flow of information. Like as you could just go forever and it will not stop. It will just keep back feeding it. So again, that's another one of those things where there's no stopping cue. And so for me, that's probably the thing for people to pay most attention to is the lack of stopping cues.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I personally play a lot of video games. And for me, I think the warning part is actually when I see randomness introduced into a game. It's like, hey, if you get a chest, 10% of the chance you will get a good sword, 90% of the chance you get a crap. And I actually had a friend who make video games in China. And what he does is very simple. You charge everybody $1,000 to buy a sword, nobody's going to buy it.
Yeah.
Okay. So you charge them a lottery system and ask them $10 per slot.
Okay.
And there is a 1 in 100 chance you will get a sword, which is basically $1,000 to get a sword.
Oh, yeah.
And now everybody just like, $1, $2, $5, $10.
Sure.
So every time I go to any game, it asks me, hey, do you want to just pay $2? You got this and this. Or even if you have a chance to get into this and this, that's the moment I say, okay, stop. I won't want to touch this thing.
Yeah. That's a great example. And how, unless you knew that, I mean, you've got insight into that because your friend who does the design shared that info with you, right? What about for all the, millions of people who don't have that same, once you know how something's made, you can certainly make, hopefully you can make different choices about it. Well, there was something else you had mentioned though, I guess another cue is when novelty gets introduced, because we habituate to, sameness. And so, If I've been playing a game for a while and it's been pretty much similar stuff, now all of a sudden there's a novel character introduced or a portal to a novel world I haven't, like that's usually a sign that they're trying to keep you in, keep your eyes and keep your attention there. So the introduction of novelty, because they don't, they want to keep you on that line of just being interested enough, but not, not overwhelmed or not frustrated. I guess that's another cue, right? If you're starting to get frustrated and you're having a hard time, then all of a sudden you get this little bonus weapon, in a video game, or something that helps you kind of nudge to that next level. That's probably a sign that they realized and they know that you're getting kind of burned out and you need a little push. So all those little kind of subtle cues that are built in and designed right into the software.
So it's almost like a injection of dopamine.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Right when you're tired, right?
Yep.
Same thing
That's
probably with videos and even music now. I just listened to a podcast from Spotify. They were trying to actually create some GitHub type collaborating platform for music makers to collaborate on music and collect live feedbacks. Like after 13 seconds, people stop listening.
Oh, wow.
Then at 13 seconds, do something.
Wow.
You
So
know?
like they would even use that to change the way they compose the music? Wow.
Yeah, for video, they're already doing it. And for movies, like if you do something really well, actually, that's how you do it. Like every time you go to a Hollywood movie, it's always like, if I don't feel tired, every time you feel tired, suddenly something just shows up, right? That's almost like a design now. So for me, that's actually the part where I found it really to differentiate between I'm designing this thing to engage you or I'm designing this thing to get you addicted. Because for me, like, where's the boundary between engagement and addicting? Because every time I see you're addictive, I can say, wow, you're engaged.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Again, but this is just me as a clinical person. I mean, the line is when that engagement turns to disengagement in other parts of your life. Like, we only have so much time in a day to devote our talents and energies. And when it moves from, again, work, your relationship, your own physical health, whatever it might be, when those things start to suffer because you're so engaged in this other thing, then that's when it becomes a problem. But that's no different than somebody who is, overworks, right, and spends 18 hours a day in the office whether it's to avoid something. So again, it can happen anywhere. But I think that's the line, is when it starts to cause harm to self or others. Maybe that's a simpler way of saying it. When it causes harm to self or others.
Interesting.
Again, if I can, do my job well enough, stay, relatively healthy, have relatively stable human relationships, and still play video games 6 hours a day, you can argue no harm, no foul. Nobody's suffering as a result of that. Maybe I'm doing less other things. Maybe my lawn's, 18 inches high, the grass, and, maybe there are other hobbies I've abandoned. But the point is, as long as I'm okay and then the people around me are okay, then I wouldn't say that would be addiction. That would be engagement.
So for layman's language, right, if I want to see if I am addicted to anything, basically I will be able to tell if I'm frustrated. It's just like every day I just feel like, where's my time? I feel like I want to do this, I couldn't do it, and I start to feel depressed or even stressed. That's probably the line. Like, okay, playing video games is definitely making me stressed. I know it. I need to feel like I need to see a psychotherapist right away, or like potentially that's probably the time we know something is wrong, right?
Well, I do think from a mood perspective, if you start to feel it's the withdrawal. It's kind of like the equivalent of withdrawal. So, if you've been exposed to a substance for a long time and then your body no longer has that, you can have physiological and psychological withdrawal. With behaviors or technology, if you're away from it for, let's say the power goes out, right, and your PS4 is down and you get extremely anxious and overwhelmed and you're starting to have panic feelings and that kind of stuff, or you're, completely depressed because you don't have your friends on your headset while you're playing on a multiplayer role-playing game, that's probably a sign, right? When you can't handle life without it. That's probably, again, a simpler way of saying it. When you can't handle life without it, when it makes you anxious, depressed, angry, any of those types of emotions, chances are you probably have an unhealthy relationship to this thing.
Interesting, yeah. I really like the one thing they wrote in the book is just, I hate this game, but I have to play.
Right.
Like,
right.
I hate this game.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah. So Alter was talking about the difference between wanting and liking.
Yeah.
And so, with substances, you eventually, you start out by liking them, but eventually you end up wanting them. And a lot of them get to that point where they no longer like it, right? It's not that they like how it feels, but they have to have it because it's so painful to not have it. And so the wanting's there, they're driven to do it. Same thing for behavioral addictions, but it loses maybe its initial kind of liking, and you just feel compelled to do it. And if you don't, you're at a loss and you suffer and all those types of things. It doesn't. It's anybody who's been stuck in an addictive pattern. It's from the outside like, oh, you must really like video games or whatever. It's like, well, no, it's not that they really like them anymore. They just can't figure a way to live without it, and it's a painful experience even in the moment, and certainly without it.
Okay, so back to our side as a consumer.
Yeah.
Like when we are faced with addictive technologies like video games or anything, let's say if I already feel like this thing is affecting my mood, but I find it really difficult to just shut the PS4 down and stop playing, do you have any suggestions other than just go and see a psychotherapist, which is pretty expensive?
Oh yeah, and
right? So do we have anything we can do to adjust that?
Well, I'll give you the two main perspectives on like managing and dealing with addiction, and I'm going to say right up front, I don't think therapy's the right answer for everybody. I don't think everybody needs it. So even as a clinician, I don't think there's plenty of ways that people can heal and get support, and it doesn't have to be through traditional therapy. But typically when you look at substance addiction, those type of things, you've got on one side you have what's typically like the 12-step models or the abstinence model. So in those, it's a disease model in the sense that there's something wrong with my brain, and when it's exposed to this substance or this behavior, I'm incapable of controlling myself. So an abstinence only would be, I can't play video games at all under any circumstance. And so I have to change my life around so that is not, so the temptation isn't there and there's no chance that I'm going to have access to these things. So that's an extreme view, but plenty of people have maybe been unsuccessful in doing it in moderation, and they find abstinence is the only way. So that would be one approach, is to say, I got to clear this thing out, got to delete this app, never have it back on again, whatever the particular technology is. Then there's others that are about teaching people how to moderate their use and figure out tools and techniques and strategies to make sure that they, if they maybe put a limit ahead of time, and there's the irony is we can use technology to put limits on technology. And so, there's apps you can download. There's a whole lot of things where you can put limits on it. So that's one way I know people manage some of their tech is like, I only get 2 hours of this app today. And when that 2 hours is up, it locks until the next 24-hour cycle is done. For a lot of people, though, if they recognize like this thing in my life is a problem, what I will say as a therapist, part of the work I would do is to try to understand what's driving the need for that thing. And so if it's loneliness or isolation or even depression or stress, so for a lot of people, it's avoidance. It's numbing. It's emotional numbing. It's cognitive numbing. It's like, oh, the stress of having to deal with all this stuff, I'd rather not. And so it's just much easier to stream these movies for 6 hours or go on this game for 6 hours. So if I have these tendencies, I notice I'm spending a lot of time on this thing, and I wasn't 2 months ago, I'd encourage people to start asking the question, what's different right now in my life? Like, why, what is it that's leading me to go, and start to slow down that process. It's like, what happened right before I had this impulse or this need to use this technology? Is there an alternative to doing that? Is there a healthy alternative? Could I reach out to somebody who is important to me and I trust, and or if it's stress, could I go hike in the bluffs for a half hour instead of going? And so I think it's kind of learning that we call it the ABCs, the antecedent, behavior, and the consequence. So what happened before? What was the antecedent situation? The behavior in this case is, like tech use or something. And then what's the consequence? And so if you can kind of slow that process down and be more mindful about what's driving some of that use, then I think people can make more informed choices about, tech and whether they're going to use it or not.
So is it fair for me to say, instead of changing the behavior, change the cause of the behavior is probably the way to go, and go back and identify the reason why are you doing this.
So I'm biased towards that approach, right?
Oh,
And so
okay.
I think only because, shouldn't we be curious about what's driving this stuff? So, but there's nothing wrong with changing the behavior. So if you want to change a behavior, you can do it in any three ways. You can change the antecedent situation, you can change the behavior itself, or you can change the consequence of the behavior. So in the instance of tech, so if we just use the example of, let's say I get stressed or bored or whatever, or lonely, and so I go to Instagram and I spend several hours on Instagram checking stuff. So if I wanted to reduce my Instagram use from an antecedent perspective, that's where I would have to say, oh, I realize I do this when I'm lonely or when I'm stressed. And so I have to treat that loneliness or stress in some other way, so then I don't have the impulse to go, numb through Instagram.
So replace that by something else,
Well, yep.
healthier.
Something healthier, yep. Or just navigate, or learning to tolerate loneliness or boredom to the point where you don't have to go there.
So personal growth.
Yeah. Now the behavior, that's one where I could just make it much harder to get to Instagram. And so I could either, put a limit on it. So that's actually trying to change the behavior itself. Or I can delete it, so it's impossible for me to actually go on Instagram. Or I can set up some app where somebody else has to enter the password for me to get access to it. So now I've made the behavior harder to do, and therefore less likely to be motivated to do it in the moment. The last one is consequences. And I think I don't like to go that route often, because people often try to use punishment as a way
Slap
to...
me on my face if I play it.
Exactly, right. Yeah.
Or $5 in the jar.
Yes, exactly. Penalty. I'll pay a penalty. If you want a really effective penalty, is you find a charity organization or a political person who you would never donate money to. And then each time you do the behavior, you have to do that, and you have to mail it, at the end. Again, I don't like having to go that consequence route. We wouldn't have to bother with that side of the equation if we could kind of work on that front end and figure out what is it that's driving the behavior. And if we could handle it up here, then we don't have to deal with that.
So if we could do it initially, like initiate from this side, don't even go to the opposite side in order to suppress this. Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I just think once it's that far downstream, it's a lot harder to deal with, a lot harder to manage.
I almost feel like sometimes if you ask me to give a fan to something, I almost feel like I already paid for it. So actually, I got all the right to play another 2 hours.
That's right.
If I'm willing to just give that guy $5.
That's true.
Right?
Yeah, that's true. Yep.
Interesting. Okay. So I know you have a kid. We just talked.
Yeah.
2 daughters, and I have a kid just born. And have you seen recently introducing technology in early life start to impact the personal growth of an infant or even kid or?
Oh, so, well, you asked this question because,
personally, as a parent, I care. Actually, when should
right.
I show my kid the first time the iPad?
Yeah. All right. So, I have a bunch of thoughts on this. Some of them are rooted in science and some are not, right? Some are just rooted in like, I'm a parent, I want what's best for my kids. What I will say, one of my former students who's in graduate school sent me an article about infant attachment. And so let me preface all this by saying a lot of this research is in its infancy, like, kind of pun intended. It's going to take, decades to kind of see longitudinally what impact. I mean, the iPad was introduced in like 2007 or 9 or 8. Yeah. So it hasn't been around long enough to really know what impact it's going to have over the lifespan. So some of this research that's being done now is going to be we'll know a lot more about this in 10 years. But back to what I was, this for me, I find it horrifying. They're looking at some of the early attachment with infants, and in this case, they were looking at breastfeeding with mothers. Infants can only see about 6 to 8 inches in front of them, so a lot of their kind of early learning is through eye contact with whoever's giving them the bottle or the breast and breastfeeding, and they're finding that some parents are, instead of gazing at their and a lot of communication happens, right? And so there's a lot of subtle cues that maybe the infant's full, and so it's time to remove the bottle or the breast, or they're fussy and they need to move, and so you see these little micro movements, and so you adjust. They're learning that when I do X, Y happens, right? So they're getting their own feedback training. And now they're finding some parents, instead of doing that, have their head over here looking and texting on a phone, and then missing all these subtle social cues and all that bonding that happens at that 6 to 8 inches. So that, when you ask about the infant piece, that's something right now that they're paying attention to and seeing what impact that has on the developing brain.
I read this too because like the infant wants your full attention.
Yes.
But if you give them divided attention,
Yep.
like they will develop something like that. And for a chimpanzee, we are probably the only creature which will look at other people in eyes.
Yes.
So we're the only creature that I would know you are not looking at me.
Absolutely, right.
So
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
actually why we have this like pupil here for us
Yeah.
to see. So
Yeah.
if you do the thing you just mentioned for infant, that's kind of like a loss of a lot of information.
Yeah, and if you think, and so this is me extrapolating a little bit on it, but if you think about the way our nervous systems develop and the way we learn, cause and effect and self-soothing and all that kind of stuff, we see this in extreme cases of neglect. So if an infant is cold and screams and is crying, hungry, and nobody comes, they learn that the world's not a safe place. It doesn't matter, like it, and not that they're thinking that, but over time, people aren't somebody who to rely on. And so they're seeing with some of these infants that, if they've got these subtle cues of discomfort and you're not noticing them, that means their nervous system has to ramp up a little bit. And so they're fussier, right? And so to get your attention, they realize they really need to make a noise and really got to move around instead of some little subtle thing. And so think about what that looks like over the long term, right? Just in emotion regulation or emotion dysregulation. So that was a long story for just a small slice of it. So back to your question too about parenting, what's the right age and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
I mean,
right amount also. Yeah.
I mean, you've got the American Pediatric Association that would say, no more than 1 to 2 hours of screen time per day, for kids under a certain age. I don't remember what that, up to what point. Now, I do want to go back and say, like, anybody who was born, 1950s and later had television screens. And I remember being a kid and spending hours in front of the Saturday morning cartoons. And even my parents, when they were kids in the 50s, talk about like how much time they spent. So it's not necessarily just the presence of screens that's going to like rot our brains, right? We all turned out just fine. However, the screens were much different now, right? In this degree of interaction, and so it's not apples and apples anymore. Right? So this new breed of technology is very different.
One thing I can add is actually it's easier to ask a kid to give up TV than to give up an iPad.
Yes, it is.
Much easier.
Right, and it's the difference between having a passive reinforcer. And so, if you look at the different types of things that people find reinforcing, one of them is passive activity, and that would be reading a storybook or hearing a story or watching TV. I don't have to do anything. I just sit here. And it's reinforcing up to a certain level. But having a manipulative, something where you're actually doing, whether that's riding a bike or, playing a video game, but doing something, most people find that more reinforcing than being just a passive recipient of it. So you're right. It's much, much harder, to kind of pry that thing out. The other thing that happens, though, with children, because, that's the other benefit of being a higher order primate, although we see this in other primates as well. We can watch other people get reinforced for things. And so imagine a small kid, if they see their parent or caregiver on the phone constantly, that thing, they don't even have ever had to actually play with that thing, but they see you on it all the time. And that's the thing that they want because, wow, this, adult is really connected to this thing. And, they see more of that, right? Now you see it out in public, you see it in all over the places. So we've also then created this image of this thing must be really, really reinforcing because everybody's got their face in it all the time. So I can tell you from a parenting perspective, we have limited our kids' screen time. They're both school age. We were one of, I think it's called Wait Till 8. So we got wait till 8th grade for a cell phone. Now, our older daughter...
8th grade, not
no.
the year 8?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, wait till 8th grade. So, now, that's not to say our older daughter... I mean, she had I even forgot, iPod, right? So she had an iPod that was that Wi-Fi enabled. So, I mean, she had this device when she was maybe 7 or 8, but she could listen to music. There wasn't a lot of apps she could use on it. But we did have her wait until she turned 13 to get a phone with a cellular connection to it. And, she was one of the last ones in her friendship group to do so. Our younger one, who's in 2nd grade, she's not allowed to have screens during the week, or any of her devices during school days, I should say. And then it becomes highly reinforcing on Friday or Saturday. But we have found, though, with the exception of a car, we do a lot of traveling, and so when they're in the car, it's like I don't care, right? If everybody's at peace and having a good time. And we've been experimenting with it over the years and what works. But we have noticed a marked difference when we give them access on the weekends, and that's enough. And then then they know there's boundaries, and then they're not hounding us about it during the weekdays. And then they find other things to do, whether it's read books with us or play games and that kind of stuff. Again, I'm not anti-technology. I know this is the world that they live in and they're going to happen, and I want them to be comfortable, interact, and know what this stuff is. But I don't want it to overtake their lives, and that be the only way that they spend their time or communicate and do all those types of things.
So use smart strategies or build a healthy relationship with technology.
There
It's
you
not
go.
anti or addictive, but it's just
Right.
find the balance. Right?
Yeah, and again, and it's not either or. Again, yeah, like you said, even at the very beginning, these things aren't inherently evil. It's not. There's nothing bad about an iPad. There's a lot of great use for it, but then there's a lot of time when we don't need it, and there's other things that we can be doing. There's other skills that we need to learn to develop that they can't replace.
It's really great you mentioned this because I think a lot of almost every parent complain about if their kids use technology too much or like stay on their phone all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But then whenever I listen to those kind of parents play, the moment they're not talking with me, they are using their phones.
Yep.
So it's really difficult for me to say, hey, you do know where they get it from, right?
Right.
So don't even just say this is the child's problem. It's actually your problem. You're creating that.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing I think I want to talk about is now we have to think about technology from a personal side, right?
Mm-hmm.
What about a sociology, social part of it? It's like, for example, your daughter, if she's the last one using technology in her class, does it create like social barriers, communications, and people think you're out, basically?
That's a perfect question because we struggle with that. I will tell you now, we have the one app we haven't allowed her to have is Snapchat, but that is like the default channel that her friends communicate with. Now, luckily, she's a group of friends. They know she doesn't have Snapchat, but we discovered this early on. Like, that's how they were navigating, like, the sleepover and who's going to be here. But then they realize they remember she doesn't have that. So when plans get made, they'll take a picture of it and then text it to her, and so or make sure that they get the word to her. So, you're absolutely right that if you take too much control and say, you're never going to use this, that if you're going to make that decision, I think as a parent, it should be a negotiation, and you should make sure you know what you're doing. Because sometimes, we're not going to know the next thing that they're on. And I certainly wouldn't want that for my child. I wouldn't want my child to feel socially isolated because we've decided arbitrarily that we're going to lock down all these, all this technology. So, but I think that's the negotiation. And you can agree or disagree with this. I own the phone. I own the phone plan. We've talked about it. And at any point, if you've given a reason for us not to trust that you're using this wisely and in good ways, we can take it away, or we can monitor it. We can say, let's see how you're using this, and are you making good choices and stuff. Somebody had made the point to me last weekend. We were talking. I think this is kind of a great analogy. With devices in our kids, most people don't hand their children keys to their liquor cabinet and say, "You just figure this out," right? Like we have.
You want a car key when they're like 12.
Right, exactly. You don't say, "Here, just figure out the car," or like go. We have rules, and there's guidelines, and you try to socialize them into it, and you teach them, and maybe there's a course in driving, like you have to learn and get a license, but we think nothing of handing an iPad over to a 4-year-old or a 7-year-old and say, hey, go off for 2 hours and figure this thing out. So it's kind of interesting that we've put so much trust into this device or these devices, these technologies, that we don't think that we need to pay attention to how they're using them or teach them healthy ways or adaptive ways to use it. And I think that's the shift that we need to do as adults, is say, how can we help support young people in more mindful use, and by the way, our own too, right? I mean, just even as adults, we could probably benefit from that, like you said.
One possible reason I see that is actually most people pay attention to their physical safety and physical health much more to physical health compared to their mental health or psychological, because I'm feeling like if there are any damage iPad is doing, it's not going to be physical. Your kids won't get burned or get crashed by a car, right? Or just get a leaker and just become wasted.
Right.
It's more about psychologically or emotionally, maybe, long term they will get damaged in a possible way.
Yeah.
But again, we don't pay so much attention to anything that is hidden under the skin, basically.
Yeah, and those types of things are likely small and cumulative over a much longer
They reinforce themselves
time frame.
a long time.
Yeah, and you can't see it. It doesn't have the same immediacy as some of the harms. I think we can, like you said, with some of this other stuff. And again, sometimes maybe we're not even there. I mean, sometimes the effects might show up 15 years later. And I'll give the example. And this is not me. So this is my students saying this to me. That a lot of them recognize how hard it is to have a difficult conversation face to face with somebody, how anxious it makes them to do that. And that was one of the activities in my seminar I'm teaching now on addictive technology, was for them to kind of reflect on that. And a lot of them said, no, I would prefer to be able to text it, because then I can think out what I'm going to write and make sure I say the quote unquote right thing. I'm sorry, that's not how most of us navigate our human relationships. They're messy at times. You learn from, making mistakes. You have a lot of nonverbals that you can play off of. There's a lot of room for error in sending and receiving messages when all you have is written language, right? And you're texting this thing. And so a lot of them will say, like, I know I want to be better at having a conversation, but I'm not comfortable. And so I'm just going to stick with this, messaging through my app, because I have time to think what I'm going to, say, and control, my messaging instead of learning through kind of experience. That for me, I think's the part that, it's sad. Like, that's the thing I don't. When I think about my children, like, I want them to be able to navigate interpersonal relationships face to face, because they're going to go out into a world, in a work world, where not everybody's 13 and Snapchatting each other, right? They're going to have to interact with people across generations, across different countries of origin. Like, I mean, there's so much room for stuff to go wrong if you're limited to this one small channel of the way you communicate. And that's what it's hard to watch when people don't have those and don't have the opportunity to do that stuff.
I remember the book you recommended me, like Alone Together.
Oh yeah, sure.
It talks a lot about this kind of thing, right? For example, as a young kid, basically the first time you are alone to the school, you won't see your parents until the end of the day, but now you just have a phone. You can call your parents whenever you want it, whenever you feel frustrated. So having been connected on the internet kind of take away the self-time you need to absorb everything you have today. And if there is a struggle, you need to actually deal with it. Yeah. That's actually part of your personal growth. And also, like, when you try to say to other people about something serious, like, I'm sorry, like, serious words, actually you need to deal with the tension, you need to deal with the facial expressions, you need to deal with, like, all the emotions coming here. They found it difficult, and technology actually make it easier for you. So now they think, well, is easier better? Because difficult is probably the only way for us to grow, right? You face some difficulties, you overcome it, that's how you actually grow. But if you take away all that, do you think that thing will actually make your personality basically underdeveloped if you just keep removing away the challenges?
I think it makes you less adaptable to a changing world. I mean, that's kind of the way I would phrase it. Whether it's underdeveloped or not, it makes you less equipped to handle novelty in human interactions. And the world is not static, and things are going to change over time. And if you haven't had those learning experiences, like you said, where maybe I learned much better through mistakes than doing the right thing, and most of us do. And if you don't ever have those opportunities, like you said, easy doesn't mean better, and short term doesn't mean it's good for the long term. And so I think easy and short term, we have this tendency like, I'll just do that because it's without knowing that there might be long term consequences to it. So I want to give you this example, and this is kind of a plug on how awesome our students are here. So each week in my seminar, I have them do, we call it life labs. So they have to do some task and then reflect upon it. This 2 weeks ago, their task was, it was first to notice when they're bored, and when then they have that impulse to go pull out their phone. And I said, initially, I don't want you to stop yourself, but just notice. Let's say, okay, I'm bored here, I'm standing in line or whatever, or I'm walking on campus, I got this. And then just to start to slow down that process and pay attention, what were you feeling physically? So what sensations did you have? What were you thinking mentally? What were you experiencing emotionally? So just to start to draw attention to that. And then at some point in the week, they had to resist the phone, and then they had to set a timer. They had to be bored for 15 minutes. Now, this is not a long period of time. But and then they had to answer all these questions about boredom and when they find themselves bored, and then what that experience was like. I was blown away. So the students only, kind of required to write maybe a couple paragraphs. This is like a small online discussion. I had students writing like 4 pages worth of how difficult that task was about just being there for 15 minutes and not doing anything. And the theme, of the 25 students, I'd say about 5 of them said, oh, this is actually kind of nice, or it was hard for 5 minutes, but then I really got relaxed, and it was really kind of nice to notice my thoughts. But the majority of them struggled with it, and the ones that struggle with it, the 2 emotions that popped up most often was loneliness, and they felt alone. They felt lonely because they weren't then. And then the second one was they felt guilty for not being productive. So they felt like, if I'm not doing anything, then I'm not being a good, productive citizen. And then they reflected on that and said how ironic it was that there's nothing productive about scrolling through Instagram, but there's that like feeling that I'm doing something. Yeah, I'm feeling productive. And the same thing with loneliness. A lot of them realized, wow, I really go to this thing when I don't want to tolerate this distress. Or stress. They'll say, I sat there and then my mind just kept racing about how many of these things they had to do, and it got very uncomfortable, and they realized, I must really avoid that a lot by just, going to the phone or whatever. So, I say that I'm impressed because I think when given the opportunity, people can reflect on what role this has, but until they're stopped and asked and or required to do it, for school, it's too easy to ignore it and just get swept up into it. And so that's been my goal for that class, is just for people to be more mindful of the way they interact with it, and hopefully make some changes and and feel like they make choices with the way they interact with technology, and not have those choices made for them. I think the cliche I like is the tail wagging the dog. And so I think with technology, oftentimes, particularly smartphones, it's the tail wagging the dog. And I want them to feel like they've got some control and some agency in the way they interact with this stuff.
It's amazing to see like how small a focus our human has. It's just like you can only focus on one thing. Once you focus on one thing, the rest you just don't notice it. But the moment you start to notice it, that's going to become amplified, right? Same thing with technology. Yeah. I tried it with myself after reading the book.
All right.
Yeah, they did an experiment in that book, the Irresistible, Addictive Technology one. They did an experiment in which basically you have 2 people having random conversations and see how engaged they are. Mm-hmm. For one group, you have a phone next to them, but you don't pick up the phone. It's dark all the time. The second one is just like exactly same scenario, but the phone is not there. Yeah. So they say just the presence of the phone without using it is going to distract you a lot. Yeah. And I say, hey, this sounds like an interesting experiment. I'm going to do it to myself. Okay. So what I do is every morning when I eat breakfast alone, if I'm alone, not talking, then I basically look at my phone. So what I do now is just close the phone for one day. The second day, close the phone, but put the phone to the other room. Okay. And basically shut the door. I know the phone is there. I just don't see it. Right. Right. Suddenly, I feel emotion. Wow. I can't say it's sad. Yeah. But definitely, it's like a loss.
A loss. Yeah.
It's like so stupid. Like cognitively, I totally know this shouldn't be there, but I know like somewhere in my brain, it's just like I feel sad.
Sure. Well, good for you for doing that. I think that's awesome.
So starting from there, I say, hey, I'm a person who doesn't use phone at all. I almost feel like I just don't surf anything. I just sometimes listen to music. Never play video games on phones. Serious gamer, right? Yeah. And never watch any videos on phone. And turns out I use phone 2 to 3 hours a day.
Wow. So
I don't even know. I don't even know where that thing come from.
Oh, I love it. because that was the other thing I had the students do. They had the first week of class, they had to predict how much time they thought they spent, and then they had to either enable screen time or one of the native apps or download one. And many of them underestimated their use by
15
probably
minutes.
40 or 50%, right?
Yeah. Oh, everybody you ask them like 15 minutes a week, then
Yeah.
several hours.
Right. I kid you not, I had a student who, in 6 days of recording, found out they had spent 40 hours on their phone. I just spent the equivalent of a U.S. work week.
But I mean, how is she supposed, or he's supposed to study or doing anything else? It's a full-time job.
Right.
Right.
Well, but that's just, that's the irony, is oftentimes that phone is being used while they're studying. And so it's like, clearly you're not getting out of that session, what you could. The irony is you could spend probably a quarter of the time studying if you shut everything off and have more efficient time. I'd say the modal number of hours that most students were reporting when they actually reported the app was closer to low 20s to mid 20s each week. And for some, it's like, wow, that's too much. Now, some of it they'll say, Snapchat's a great example. They said, this is the way we communicate, and I'm not willing to spend any time because this is how I stay connected to my family back home and my friends here, and that's fine. But then they said, but I realized I was spending 2 hours a day just randomly scrolling through, passively through Instagram or something else. I don't need to be doing that. But the amount of time some folks are spending is amazing once you pause and pay attention to it.
It's great you mentioned this. Actually, I want to ask your opinion on this, a professional opinion on this.
Yeah.
I never believe in multitasking.
Oh, yeah.
I think like multitasking give you some kind of excitement to make you feel productive, but if you just go back and evaluate everything objectively, it's just like you produce nothing compared to just work on one thing at a time.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Oh gosh, yeah. Like this isn't even my professional opinion. There are mounds of data that suggest the human brain is not capable of multitasking. Now the terminology, I'll be specific about it. We're not capable of doing divided attention. So, and I actually, no matter what class I teach, even whether it's related to stuff or not, I actually do, at the very first class, I run all my classes through a divided attention task, just to show them that you can't do it. And I love the research in divided attention because there's so much of it, and it's some of it's quite funny, because the people who will self-report as the best multitaskers often perform the worst on tasks that they're required to do it. And so, the story in neuroscience and psychology is, yes, we can multitask when it's not competing for the same resources in the brain. So I can walk and talk at the same time because that's a well-developed motor skill, and so it doesn't require any cognitive space for me for my body to move that way. Now, if I had a traumatic brain injury or a stroke and had to relearn to walk, you can bet I'm going to be struggling to be doing some other cognitive task while I'm trying to retrain my body. But once something's automatic, and so I can do dishes because that's an automatic thing while I'm doing something else. But as soon as we start to try to do two tasks that occupy the same kind of neural modules, we can't do it. And so there's a lot of experiments people can do, and I always tell people, just have one person in this ear telling you a story and one person in this ear telling you a story, and I guarantee you are not going to get their story straight. We can't do it. We cannot do parallel processing. Now, computers are great at it, and that's why they can churn a lot of information. We can't. We are serial processors. And the evolutionary psychologists and biologists argue that for most of our human history, we've had a pretty simple, our stimuli are pretty simple. Like, we haven't had a lot, there's at any given time, there's not a lot that we're having to take in. And we haven't evolved the skill or cognitive space to do that. And people always underestimate that. And what they're not actually multitasking, they're not doing parallel processing, they're task switching. And every time you task switch, you lose cognitive efficiency. And there's
probably take you a significant amount of time to refocus. Right?
Yeah, they say on that, there was a series of studies they did with people in the workplace, and people who were reporting kind of being in a flow state, like so a creative state, and then distracted. They said on average it took them like 20 to 24 minutes to get back to that cognitive state. And so I always tell students, just think about you're studying, you're reading something, and then your phone pings, and then you check, or your email, or like you're going from thing to thing. You're not encoding information as efficiently. When it comes time to decode it and recall it later, it's not going to be as readily available. They think they can listen to music and study at the same time. They say, well, we get bored. I said, well, they've done research on music, and if it's instrumental, it's fine. But if there's lyrics and you find yourself singing lyrics, that that verbal
That's different part of the brain.
right. So the same part that's recalling is and singing and is the same part that you're needing to use to read this passage, and so you're going to have some inefficient learning going on. We are just not good at multitasking, no matter what we think. And so that's in all my classes, I'm trying to encourage students, you are better off spending 15 minutes of quiet, focused, dedicated time. Now, I say that and I know that, and yet I fall victim to it constantly, right? But I'll be at work and my email's notifying, and I'm working on a paper, but then I'm over here, and it's like if I was really practicing what I preach on a more frequent basis, I would probably set very discrete times when I wouldn't be interrupted, and I would just be focused on one task.
The first time I noticed this is actually when I go to those kind of professional meetings for mathematics or AI.
Oh, yeah.
And just like every time you got a keynote speaker, you got people all open up their laptops and starting to just, type replying email and listen. And after like 20, 40 minutes, they just look around and show the speaker like, I'm still listening.
Right.
I would feel like, okay, I can't do that. I either don't go to the talk or I need to go there and fully attend it.
I'm with you.
Yeah.
I first noticed it on conference calls in my first career, because we were a multinational company, and so my work team, I might be working on a team that was in India and one would be in Ireland at our development centers, and you'd be on a conference call that should only take 15 minutes, but you could hear tick, 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 tick in the background, and somebody say, I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I didn't hear you. And it's like, no, it's not that you didn't hear me. It's like you weren't listening because you were doing something else. And so we would spend like 45 minutes on, and you think about how much time and money you're spending to have all these people in one place while people's attention is divided.
And they think they're more productive.
And they think they're being productive.
Okay, so for my students who are listening to this, number one, multitasking is fake.
Yes.
Okay, period.
Yep.
Number two, so in class, please take your phone away and please close your laptop. You think you are doing one homework and listening to my lectures? No, you're not. Because I've received multiple times, right after I tell you what the quiz is, the first question I receive after class is, what is the quiz is on? Okay, I'm pretty sure I know why. Number three, do not text or even call, hopefully, when you're driving. So driving is kind of like on the edge because you think you don't use resource once you get used to it. But if anything happened,
there's very clear literature on the impact of texting while driving, and the deficits it has in your ability to focus and pay attention is equivalent to being intoxicated. And so they've done enough driving simulation studies, where they've had people, with no alcohol, and then those that have a certain blood alcohol content. I think one that I looked at, it was the blood alcohol equivalent of like 0.05 to 0.08 was texting. And so it's as harmful on your attention as it is if you had a few beers. And yet a lot of people say, oh, no, I would never drive drunk, but wouldn't bat an eye to text while they're driving. And so that was another topic that we talked about in our class. And it's like, well, but I can't help myself. And here's how you change here's how you make the behavior difficult. Take your phone and shove it in the back seat so you can't reach it. You still have it. If you need to get to it when you stop and make a phone call, that's fine, but you cannot do those things at the same time. It cannot be in the back seat and be in your hand. I also share this example. My neighbor was a president of a bank here in town, and nature of the business was constantly connected and texting, and he felt like he had to respond. The only thing that could get him to stop texting while driving was he had to put a picture of his 3 young children right where his phone would be as a reminder to say, don't do this. Right? You got these.
You even put a small drop of blood.
Right.
Over his face and say, this is what you're gonna get.
Right. And it's just like, but people fool themselves and they think, oh, this is harmless, or it's just this little, it's just for 5 seconds. Well, that's 5 seconds traveling at 75 miles an hour when something. That's one where I've got little to no tolerance for. And I was pleased to see like Apple release the Do Not Disturb function, and at least to give people a peace of mind that they can auto respond when they receive text. But I think that's an example we could do a lot better with tech solutions to those problems and make it nearly impossible for people to do those things at the same time.
And we have good reasons. So don't
Exactly,
say we're forcing you to do
Right.
You shouldn't be doing that.
Right.
So we lock it.
Yep. Yeah,
Right.
that should be a no-brainer, but it's not. If your students are listening, this is the task I would ask them to do to test whether or not they can multitask. Or
I would definitely do that to myself.
so we'll have them do this. I have them all recite the letters A through J as quickly as possible out loud, right? And then I say I time them. So they're like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, right? And it takes 2 to 3 seconds to do that. Then I said I want you to recite the numbers 1 through 10 out loud as quickly as you can. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? 2 to 3 seconds. Now I say I want you to interweave those recitations. So I want you to say A1, B2. And everybody laughs, and I'm timing them, and it takes like 16 to 20 seconds to do that third task. If you could truly multitask, it would only take 4 to 6 seconds to do that third one. But that's not what's happening. We have to engage our working memory and hold this number and letter
So that's
here.
almost tripled the number.
Oh, yeah,
Triple,
yeah,
right,
yeah.
okay.
Triple to quadruple the
Okay.
time it takes because we cannot multitask. And it's kind of a fun way to get them to say, oh, yeah, this is not something that we can do. And I think the more we can get, do those little mini experiments, well, just like you did with your phone, like actually try this stuff and see what impact. I mean, that I think, it increases the likelihood of actually somebody making an insight and maybe making a behavior change rather than telling them don't, don't multitask. They have to kind of experience it and learn it for themselves.
It's just too easy to ignore.
It is. It
Yeah.
is.
It's really interesting to see how easy your behavior can be modified by very small things,
Yep.
just like the non-stop button, right?
Yep.
I remember there was an example about watching porn
Yeah.
in one of the books you recommended me.
Mhm.
It's just like before when you watch porn, you have to actually go to the store,
Yeah.
walk in. First, you need to come out, take your car or bike there, walk in,
Right.
select with hard copies, and come back, try some of the, contents, and then
Yeah.
go to the cashier, cash out. You walk out, and random people walking by, they will look at you with a judgmental look.
Right. Right.
Now you just go online, click, suddenly it's there. Basically, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
But this one become much easier, much harder to refuse.
Right, and there's little to no barriers. So porn's a great example. 30 to 40 years ago, they looked at earliest age of exposure for boys and girls, and it was like initially like 16 and 18. So boys on average were at like 16. But this was back when like magazines, like they had to find a magazine that their dad or uncle had or something. The latest data that came out a few years ago, 8 and 10. Right, so now the
Were
average.
they actively looking for that?
No, that's
So it's
just
just
it.
random showed up.
Yep, that it's finding its way into their lives on technology, right? So they could be on the computer Googling something or doing whatever, and then all of a sudden they're exposed to imagery that they weren't even looking. No, an 8-year-old doesn't have the.
That's what I'm.
They're not looking for it. They don't even know what it is. So the barrier. Not only have the barriers been removed to even getting it in the first place, but it's now just getting shoved out there, and people are discovering it. So, but that's the other that downside to technology. It's moved from pull to push. And so that's the one thing that my students don't understand too. Like when I was in college when email kind of came out. Now came out before slightly with like CompuServe and AOL, but I had actually like check my email. I had to tell the server pull this message down, right? And now everything's pushed. Right? I get notifications on my apps. Some changes in the weather. Boom, this thing. And so
It's almost like the email asking you, check me.
right, exactly. Yep. Yeah, so it's saying stop what you're doing now, shift your attention, open this thing up and see. Whereas before I had to make a choice to do it, and here it feels less of a choice for a lot of people because all these apps have notifications. But that was another assignment. Was people were talking about smartwatches because I love mine, but I had to set rules. Like I don't want every app notifying my wrist that something's happening. As there were students saying, "Oh yeah, it's so annoying." I was like, "Well, then turn it off." Like you can go in there at the app level. So I think sometimes people feel powerless against that push technology, and so it's intruding in their lives kind of constantly. But again, there's technological workarounds for that same technology. The do not disturb function at night. Mine goes on. This is my wife and I have a disagreement about this. Because she doesn't turn hers off, but so her phone might light up. Mine at 10 o'clock to 5 in the morning, you can't get through to me, via text unless you bypass it by saying urgent or you're on my list of favorites or whatever. So there are ways that we can kind of try to keep some of this to a minimum where it's not constantly bothering us.
Another small tip to take away from that book, which was really interesting. Whenever you're trying to go to sleep, If you look at any light which is blue,
Blue wave light.
that actually make you more
Yeah.
excited. But if you look at anything which is red and warm,
Yeah.
that thing actually will remind you this is at night and you should go to sleep.
Yeah.
So even just the screen light up, how harmful can it be? Actually, that will remind your brain you're awake and this is
Yes.
daytime.
And that here's the other challenge with that though is there's great variability in our sensitivity to blue wave light and in its activation on our neurons, and so chances are probably most people aren't going to be radically impacted by it, but there are people who are more sensitive than others, and so if it's an hour before bedtime and they've been in low light and their body's starting to wind down, their brain's starting to wind down, and then they get exposed, it can activate and make sleeping harder. But the irony is, tech companies now are, talking about releasing red light, apps, and so they're, some of them are at least saying, okay, you can have this option. So
it's like a night mode 1 hour after 6 o'clock, right?
Yep.
Okay.
So I like that. I mean, they seem to be responding in some
But every time I see something like that, it's always like, okay, are they trying to accommodate me, or are they trying to manipulate me?
Right.
Right. Yeah. Like, now you got more attention suddenly because
right.
you give me like night light.
Now you're craving some other app. There's something about the red light maybe that's still driving.
Yeah,
you
before I
crazy.
feel bad whenever I look at a bright screen at 10 o'clock, I feel like, wow, I shouldn't look at this. It's too harsh. But now it's like, wow, it's so comfortable for the eyes. And it feels like a fireplace. So
That's right. A
Right.
little longer. I'll just do a little longer.
okay, so we talk about technologies. We talk about both sides, what companies are doing, what we should be doing. Now I want to ask a harder question. That is, let's ignore what kind of technology we have, but we do admit the internet or technologies make us more connected than ever before.
Yep.
Through to other person. Do you feel like technology make us lonely, or do you think actually technology solved our loneliness?
If you hang around me long enough, you'll hear me say both and constantly. It depends or both and.
Yep.
Because actually there is some research about technology and loneliness. Because there are some folks, for whatever reasons, it could be limited mobility, it could be language barrier, it could be any number of reasons why there might be people who prior to electronically mediated communication might have been quite isolated and didn't have anybody coming in on a daily basis. And so I think there are folks, there's definitely a section of the population that this has opened a whole new world and much more access to others. So I think in that way it can be extremely beneficial and reduces loneliness for people. On the flip side, I've heard people kind of ask of this. So think about all the people that you contact on a regular basis electronically. That you would say you're connected to electronically. And then ask yourself, if you had a critical health emergency or some horrible thing happen in your life where you needed somebody to step in and help, who in that list could you count on to be there?
Especially your Instagram friends.
Exactly. And if you can't answer that question, if there isn't anybody in your immediate community that is on that list, I would say that is a problem. And so I think you'd find yourself quite lonely if all of your connections are, remote and, across the ocean or time zones and that kind of stuff. So I don't think it's good or bad. I think it's, again, it has to be a healthy balance between the two. Now, I've taught abroad now 5 or 6 times. Do I love technology even when I travel? FaceTime has been the best thing ever for my kids and me when I'm apart from them, or my kids to get to spend more FaceTime with their grandparents and cousins and all that kind of stuff. So in that way, I think and even if I'm traveling, it helps reduce loneliness. When I'm sitting there in a hotel room thousands of miles away, thinking of them and can actually pull them up and even read a book. I mean, I can read. I've traveled with a book and then FaceTime my daughters and then read the book there. So in that way, I think it greatly reduces loneliness. But that is just, in that case, it is just an extension or a supplement to my actual human connection with them, right? It's a temporary replacement. I do think I'm concerned if people's only social connection is mediated electronically, because it doesn't matter. It's still an analog to human connection. We're still social creatures. We're still physically social creatures. We still benefit from physical closeness. There's some psychiatrists that call it like limbic resonance, and so that emotional part of our brain. We feed off each other's emotional states too. Like this is, I guess maybe this is the example I use. Is it more fun, or is it more fun to watch a scary movie alone or in a movie theater? Or most people say, well, in a movie theater with like a lot of other people. It's also funny. We laugh more when we're in a group of people watching a movie than when we're alone. So, we play off of each other's emotions a lot. And so I think that gets lost in electronic communication. And so I think that has the potential to create loneliness if you've basically eliminated all that kind of face-to-face contact with people.
So is it fair to say, like, it's better to view the technology as an extension or like to the traditional way that you cannot communicate, but now you can communicate. So that's a good addition to what we have, but don't replace the old way with a new one.
I feel pretty strongly about that.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, unless there's no other opportunity, like I still think the new way is better than nothing. All right. So it's better than like total isolation. But it should just be an extension and again, used wisely or used sparingly in addition to our normal connection.
That goes back to actually an interesting thing mentioned in the book, Alone Together. It's just like machine is better than nothing.
Oh, right.
Or is it better than what we have, right?
Right.
Interesting scenario, I want your opinion on this, is that is like, for example, we got a kid or like a pair of kids and their parents are super busy. So in this kind of case, should they think about like getting a robotic dog? Robotic doll, which they know it's fake, but my parents is not here either way.
Right.
Should we have a replacement, or should we just say, and if whatever you want to find human, human is better, but it's not available.
Yeah, right.
Right. Same thing with the senior homes and all the stuff. Like, okay, one nurse, 30 patients. You want human care? Well, it's divided, right? But if everybody got a pet, robotic pet, and it doesn't even matter like if the robotic pet can do anything human. It's just as long as you can project your emotion onto that thing, that will be a solution. I used to.
Yeah.
Where do you stand on that?
Oh man. I am like deeply ambivalent. Like I'm deeply torn about it. Because that's the part of that Turco book that I just get like stuck on.
I feel the same way too.
I do. Because the cynical part of me would be like, well, that's the wrong question to ask. I mean, what we should be doing is how can we restructure our institutions and lives so that's not even the question. So it's like how can my work life be different so we do have time, or how can we set up senior care communities differently so we're not having to buy robotic dogs for them. But I guess if push came to shove, I mean personally, I would rather have the robotic dog than nothing at all. So, but at what cost and what I don't know. Yeah, I'm torn. I'd be interested in what you thought about it.
Yeah, every time I see something, it's more about like, I prefer the old way. But then I just ask myself, is it because I was raised in the old way? Maybe this is the new norm, right? I always remember while reading the books, always remember a story I read about the first time people invented phone. People call each other, before they're like noble people. They see each other, greetings, sir, with all this kind of, gestures and everything to show you're a decent person. Now just say hello.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And that's it. You just talk right after hello. They found this is ridiculous, but for my generation, that's like if you say hello, that means you're a decent person. Usually, you just jump right through it. Right. So I'm just more thinking like, is it because I'm getting older, and the new norm is just like that? People communicate through text. They break up through text. They hang out through text. Another thing I personally struggle with is actually, this is my situation, right? I had a baby. Okay. I never want to share that thing on Facebook. I feel like maybe this is not fair to say, but I don't feel like not everybody is worthy to see this. I want you to know that you are my friend. That's why I want you to know at like first time. So I actually manually send every single friend the picture of my son and I got a baby today instead of posting that thing online. Basically, it does exactly the same thing, but way harder.
Exclusive access.
Exactly. So that's the moment I feel like, I don't know if I'm just stubborn, I'm still doing this, or actually this is still a good thing to do. The same thing in the book, right? Whenever the author raised that she got a friend, who went to Saigon or something. Like she was writing some articles there, and then she sent her a letter every time. She feel like I'm so special. Like if she got to send one letter, it's for me. Now she just posted on Facebook.
Yeah.
Or you got some cousin just know, oh, my brother got married, and I saw that thing from Instagram.
Right.
You didn't even bother calling.
Yeah.
But I mean, from the other side, you see like I'm letting everybody see it. This is actually the most efficient way to save a lot of trouble. So yeah, I'm struggling with that thing too. I'm careful, like I'm embracing all the new stuff. I want to learn it, but meanwhile, I'm still like an old-fashioned way of doing certain kind of stuff.
I'm with you. I constantly ask myself that question: is well, yeah, I don't know. I blanked on the actual question. Oh, no, here's the phrase that I've said now, but I might be just saying this to make myself feel better. You know, I have said I'm grateful that I lived pre-internet and during and post. I mean, I was on the first Google beta, all right? Because I feel like I can make choices about my use. And I was like, wow, I feel bad for like a 14-year-old who doesn't have all those other experiences. But then I have to ask myself, well, wait a second. I mean, that's pretty that's pretty obnoxious, because their life is going to be different. Even right, they'll have their up to 14, and then maybe when they're 40 something, they're going to look back and say, wow, you know, I'm glad I just had Snapchat for those 14 years, and now
who knows what you have
right
after
now
40 years.
it's all augmented reality and all that, you know. So yeah, I think some of it is the familiar, but I don't know. Here's the one thing that we have not been able to engineer our way around is the need for human connection. We have not found, a fix or a way around the fact that human beings need each other, and they need to be able to depend on each other. That has not changed, and our physiology is not going to change. I guess that's my other defense of it, is that, we're living in bodies and brains that evolved over millions of years to serve very specific functions, and yet this modern version is such a short time in that history. We don't. The multitasking is a good example. We do not have the brain architecture to be able to multitask, and yet we have a culture and technologies that demand it in some ways. Now, I don't know. 40,000 years from now, might we be able to do that? Who knows? So I still think, even as all these things change, there's still some components of it that will never change. Like you're a parent now. Technology cannot replace the bond that you as a parent have with an infant. It's
magical, yeah.
Yeah, I got to ask you that question. Like, how comfortable would you be, putting them in a little unit that delivers food, and but then all you do is connect over a screen,
and maybe a robotic arm. Every time they cry, I just pat them.
Exactly.
Even have part of my skin on it with the same warmth.
Right.
Yeah.
You're not going to choose that, and I will guarantee you, your child would not grow and develop, with all those important human components, if that was what was raising them, was a robotic hand that was the same temperature, and we have not been able to replicate that.
Interesting. So natural selection is actually making us to change slowly, very, very slowly. Meanwhile, the technology revolution is changing extremely fast. So we start to feel those kind of distortions. It's just like we're chasing the technology. Yep. We will never change as fast as technology change. Nope. So do we really want to change ourselves to adapt to technology? Or do we really want to change the technology to adapt to us? That's probably the other question to ask, right?
Yeah, well, I like the second one. Or now we're getting into AI, which I know you're interested in. You talk about the singularity. At what point does technology get to a point where it becomes sentient and then no longer needs us?
Yeah, I recently read a paper about a theoretical model of the brain. His name is Jeff Hawkins. He runs a company called Numenta. This is the first time human history we ever had a theoretical model of the brain, which may or may not work, but I strongly believe that thing can be a good start. Yeah. So probably within 20, 50 years, we can solve the cognition problem. So we do have artificial intelligence. But it's only for the intelligent parts, not for the emotional part.
Right. Yeah, that's a much harder algorithm to crack for sure. But who's to say you couldn't crack it 1,000 years from now?
An interesting thing for that is actually a lot of people ask, what will the tomorrow be like when you have AI? But I think a better question to ask after reading a lot of books, everybody says like we should ask, what should tomorrow look like? Because we could do something to make it work for us.
Yes.
Like we can be consumed by all this kind of stuff, or we can actually say, hey, we don't like that way. We want you to behave in this way.
Yep.
Like nuclear weapon is clearly one way. Like
Yep.
you can use physics to build that, or you can use physics to build like transistors, right? There are so many things you can do, and you can do things to actually compete for people's attention, to wipe out every competition and start to do big social experiments to make profit for what, right? So that's why I say like more and more I think people are paying attention to this. I think that's a good thing. At least in the AI community, people are actually working together. In 2015, actually, they had a big gathering at Puerto Rico to just sign an agreement on like with 6,000 people doing AI research to sign that we're not going to use AI to do this and this and this and this and this. So they're actually aware of that. I think the media should say actually a little bit more about what AI is, and in a really neutral, and instead of just competing for headlines like Terminators and Skynets, right? So that's kind of like, you don't want people to be scared of that. You should let people start to know what AI is. Then you find, okay, this is nothing but just a mathematical model which uses gradient descent, which I don't know what the terminology is, but it sounds like mathy and computer sciencey. So nothing to worry about. It's just another algorithm.
Right.
Right.
And this one can predict when you're going to have a heart attack and alert. I mean, it's like it can facilitate human decision making in some of these ways and automate some of these processes.
But it's not a real crystal ball.
Right.
Right. So that's the major thing here. So yeah.
So, but what you just said is one of the other messages like that Tristan Harris talks about, the Google engineer. That was his argument, at least at the end of this TED Talk, was why not have these companies use what they know to help us create more, fulfilling interaction. So use the example. It's like, okay, he was talking about online outrage and how easy it is to spark outrage on a post. You can say something, and then everybody gets outraged. If you want to, let's say you post something controversial. If you truly want to have a conversation, controversial conversation, difficult conversation, wouldn't it be cool if you could say, put it out there, and then you find out, the example was, I made dinner plans with you. So you're a friend of mine, we made dinner plans. You just called and said, I can't go. I'm feeling kind of lonely. And so now I post to Facebook, here's a topic that I think is really interesting and controversial. And then it says, here's all the people in your area who don't have plans in their calendars who might, and now instead of having this all done online, people are alerted to say, hey, Ryan's free from 6 to 8, dinner at his house. Why don't we go over here and have this controversial conversation face to face? They're saying, why can't we use social media and technology as a way to help facilitate those experiences more rather than replace them?
So instead of having a conversation online, which is certainly we don't want, it's simplified.
Yeah.
But it's really hard to find people to talk with you. So just use technology to replace the part which is redundant and boring.
Yep.
But actually leave the fun part offline, right?
Exactly. Yep. And help and you use location-based stuff, and you find out who's available, and you pull into all those cool kind of tech pieces that I think are pretty neat. But then you use them to facilitate the face-to-face stuff instead of
interesting.
the opposite.
After I learned a little bit of psychology myself, I started to see how powerful this thing is at the individual level. But then if you look at big data, like marketing, now you have something called behavioral economics.
Yeah.
It's basically like using psychology, doing economics. And did you know that also about the scandal Facebook was in? The Cambridge
Analytics?
They basically pulled a big 5 trait from Facebook interaction and used that thing to predict which side are they going to pick on politics.
Yep.
So do you see this as a trend, like it's a really promising and exciting future, or actually no, this is actually where we start to differentiate from the correct path that evil thing can happen?
I think probably the latter. Could you have used that in some positive way? I don't know. That's not the way it's used, though. So, a lot of the stuff that's come out about so now you've got some one of their lead researchers, I just heard an interview, I think he was on Fresh Air, about Cambridge Analytics and the work, and when he eventually left, because he's like, well, once he realized what was going on, they were using it to find people who were vulnerable to messaging, and then but very deliberately collecting them in these small communities in like a bar or a restaurant with these key phrases that they know based on their online stuff and then he was saying some of the political phrasing that came out of those algorithms were then showing up in political campaigns as the main campaigns. But that was all like nefarious use of data and with an active intent to manipulate public opinion. I think Alphabet, Google's parent company, I think the lawsuit's still being reviewed, but very similar that it was discovered they had algorithms that were feeding videos. So if I went to find a political video, I'd watch it, and then it would say based on that, now I'm gonna feed you another one that's slightly related but a little off, and then 12 videos later.
Through a process, right?
12 12 videos later, you're watching some fake news. I mean, like quite literally a fake, something that's completely false. And they're finding, some people are susceptible to those messages. And so that's that ugly side of, knowing this information about you and some of your psychology and traits, and knowing that you might be prone.
It's actually much easier to predict than everybody thought. It's really easy, especially when you have a scale.
Yep.
If that only works 5% of the time to get right, but think about times that thing by 1 million people.
Exactly.
How many people are you affecting?
Yep.
Right?
Yep. Yeah, and I'm glad you made that point. Base rate matters because it's very easy on the outside to say that's not that many people.
You think minority is like 1%? Yeah, you're talking about.
Well, 1% of a billion
can
influence an election. So, with your original question, I think there's always going to be, bad actors when that technology. So you cannot have a technology and keep it pure and
it's impossible,
right? And who gets to decide who the good people are, right? And like the right way to use it. So there's always going to be somebody who's going to try to game it or manipulate it in a way to their advantage, and sometimes in negative ways. So
another thing I kind of feel is I play video games, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the same thing probably works for movies and TV shows. It's just when you can use big data, what Netflix claim, they can use big data to pick the right actor, to write the right play for you to consume.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with video games. And it's really hard for any good independent artist to actually develop something and ignore whatever everybody want to listen. I just that's almost like the traditional creative arts we were thinking about, right? You don't want feedback.
Right.
You don't want massive feedback at the moment. You don't want to please anybody.
Mm-hmm.
But I kind of start to feel like in video games, especially those kind of meeting the needs of the audience, feeding the audience to generate profit is hurting the creativity in the individual artist and studios. It's just really like, for example, if you really want to make money in the video game industry. Try to do something which is like 3 megabytes, put that thing on an iPhone, you'll make more money than just you go seriously for 5 years to develop one game,
right?
Which has some cultural significance in it, right? So I kind of feel like that thing is starting to hurt.
Yep.
This kind of things.
Yep, I absolutely agree. And when you've got such large companies with that much, that much resource,
there's no way you can compete with them or anything. Yeah.
No, and then the question is: are they reflecting reality? Or are they creating it? Are they reflecting cultural needs? Or are they creating cultural needs? And if you show the same imagery over and over and over again, people eventually come to believe that this is the way things are and look. And video games is a good example. I forget the documentary I was watching that did kind of analyze like your typical character, and this white male with a rugged face doesn't show emotion. They reify a lot of these stereotypes that are harmful, and like you said, it removes diversity, cultural diversity. It removes a whole lot of variation that's important. That's always been important for the arts, but it mass creates and mass distributes.
One thing worries me is that like all these power are held by companies. It's just like they may use that thing to do good things or evil things, but it's really their call.
Yeah.
Or maybe some people's call. That's the part which makes me worry a little bit. It's just like it's purely just some individual's decision,
right,
for massive scale. So that's really scary.
And that's the thing that stood out to me, I think, most in Adam Alter's talk, and I know he mentioned it at the intro of the book, like how many heads of these tech companies don't allow their own family members
so they know what's going on, right?
Because they know what's behind the curtain. Yeah, and he called it like dog fooding or something. And so it's like, if they know that this thing is not ultimately probably good for their own children, but they're more than happy to, put it out there and sell it to everybody else. It kind of makes you wonder, about
Okay.
it.
Okay, so I think we hit a long time.
Yeah.
I would like to close with a last question. It's
Yeah.
more like a philosophical.
Yeah.
Do you feel like we're too obsessed with science and technology? Like every time we have some trouble, we say, hey, technology is the solution.
Oh, wow.
Like we don't see it from like how do we make ourselves as a better individual or better. Almost we don't think anymore in like a better community way to solve a certain problem compared to like, hey, there's a technology which can fix it fast and reliable.
Okay, so you're talking to somebody who loves science, right? Like, and I always have. I love math. I love the physical sciences. And eventually, I was always going to be like a aeronautics or robotics engineer, and then eventually discovered psychology later. I love science, and I love your question. For me, I hear it. We've taken the art out of art and science because I think for a lot of human cultural history, those things were very interrelated.
You develop geometry, suddenly people pen better.
Yes.
You develop algebra, suddenly people sing and compose
Right.
better. Right?
Yeah, these things were like integrated, and they were seen as one. And you couldn't have art without science, and you can't have science without art. I don't know culturally if it's like post-space race here in the United States, where you probably could argue that we have maybe the pendulum has swung a bit too much to science, and just look at the way schools and PK-12 schools have allotted resources, and it's like if you've got limited money, are you going to close the art class? Are you going to close the computer class, whatever? And it's always the art class, and then the question is at what expense? So I think science and technology, clearly I into it, right? I wouldn't be an academic. I wouldn't be doing this stuff. I believe in it, but it only tells part of the story. And I guess I'll go back since we've talked about kids and I keep talking about human connection and stuff. At the end of the day, I'm not approaching my human relationships with this purely scientific view, and is the input and the output work out, and is the algorithm right here? That's not the way most of us kind of engage with the world. When I'm on vacation, if I'm out in nature, I'm not necessarily sitting there saying, well, scientifically, right? I'm just taking in the art. If I'm at an art museum or if I'm watching a play or a musical, like I'm there for the experience, and I'm not saying, well, is this composition done so in a way that mathematically it's pleasing to my ears? I'm just like, this is, this is something I'm enjoying. And so I do think that we risk relying on technology and science to solve all our problems when we have one, instead of sometimes, I don't know, maybe trusting that artful side of humanity as a way to get there. Man, that's a good question, though.
Great, yeah. Okay.
What do you think?
I was training in mathematics.
Mm-hmm.
I had a PhD, undergraduate and then PhD straight, and then become a professor. So when I was like 30, 32 years old, I find everything just so efficiently done.
Mm-hmm.
And I see the whole world from a mathematical way. It's like black and white, everything simplified.
Mm-hmm.
Like I see something, I see the objective side right away. I don't care too much about my feeling, because if you suck, you suck. Like
Mm-hmm.
no matter how you feel, you suck, right? If you're great, you're great,
Uh-huh.
right? I assess everything from like a quantitative and
Gotcha.
qualitative point of view. Until I started to learn a little bit about psychology, like 2 years ago, and then that's just non-stop starting from there. Because before I try to say, hey, I want to be successful. I'm pretty efficient in terms of like being successful. What's the next goal? What's the next goal? Up to a certain point, I start to say, hey, it's so bored. Like buying regular stuff won't excite me. So I say, hey, I either buy houses, which is expensive, or I buy cars. Then I start buying cars. So I got it's a long story. For the first time I entered American, that was 2008. I bought a very crappy car, but I changed a car every year. So basically, I bought 10 cars during the first 10 years.
Oh my gosh.
They're not good cars, but I just wanted something new, right? To stimulate my needs and desires. Until one day, I just bought my current car, which is an Audi. And I tried a Mercedes and everything. That's the moment I started to feel like, wow, number one. Every spring, when spring comes, I kind of feel like it's time to change cars, and everything. And I changed the Audi, and that's the first time in my life I feel like, first, I had the Audi. I was excited for half a day. Just the purchasing process.
Yeah, yeah.
Once I got that, it's just another regular car. Why do I need this? Like a Camry does the same thing, or even a cheaper car, right? And then I'm also thinking about, what about next year? Like, what's better than the Audi? I tried a Mercedes, so not a Mercedes because I picked Audi out of Mercedes.
Yeah.
A Porsche? Why do I want to do that? That's a lot of money.
Right.
And then after Porsche, that kind of hold me another year. What's next, right? So that's the moment I start to see, okay, I need to learn how to enjoy life without spending money.
Okay.
That's the first time in my life I realized this has become an issue. You know, and then starting from there, I started to read philosophy, psychology, and suddenly I feel like I didn't spend a penny. My life is 10 times better.
Wow.
My life is 10 times better firm.
Wow.
I could enjoy so much more. And I can see things from multiple perspectives. And mathematics is always like my favorite way. It's just like simplified and everything's just beautiful. But you start to see the complexity of it. You see the same thing from a psychological point of view and like a biological point of view, neuroscience point of view, all this stuff. And finally, I start to reflect on myself. It's just like my life. Every time I have some, like just after learning some psychology, every time I do something, I feel like, wow, there's a reason. Maybe some part of my brain is doing this, or maybe I did this just because some childhood memories or something like my cognition, hierarchical structures, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I feel like my life is just so much better because I can enjoy so much more. So I actually redirect all my time to earning money before and redirect it to, just learn more so you can enjoy more for the same phenomenon. Just like you're in the same house, but suddenly you feel you can see much more.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's why I say, like, why I try to study this podcast, I was trying to say, like, science, technology. And then I thought, like, why don't I just share my journey during the past 2 years with other people, just like learning a little bit about human science, learning a little bit about psychology, which usually people don't have other than a gen ed course.
Right.
Unless you're a psychology major, like how much psychology do you take?
Right.
But actually, I feel like that's the valuable thing to take, because you don't take psychology for jobs unless you're a very special group of people, right? Or like you don't take history just for jobs. You take it for fun to make yourself a better human being. And I almost that's the moment I feel like I think I start to see the distortion is not just like, how to say. After I developed the second paradigm, which is controlled experiment, and also the third paradigm, which is first principle. Once we have that, our science start to accelerate so much that thing just exploded during the past 200 years. It's just like one thing built on another. And once you know step C, you will definitely know step D. It's just a matter of time, right? So this thing just built on itself so much, it just explodes in terms of speed. But if you go to the human side, about philosophy, psychology, sociology, and everything, that's actually developed very, very slow, because they are kind of studying a different way. You don't do controlled experiment. I mean, you do have psychometric and all this stuff, but again, right, philosophy, how do you do controlled experiment? Right? Or sociology is like, you can introduce some science into it, but I feel like that's not just another world. It's not objective world. And now at my age, with my education, I start to see actually how important that side is to human being compared to what the world is. Right, so that's a kind of like a differentiation between knowledge and wisdom. You can learn knowledge from science, but not wisdoms.
Oh, I like that.
You can learn technology, but you are still like naive about how to use technology to make you live better. Better technology doesn't mean better life.
Right.
Faster things doesn't mean better life.
Right.
Easier things doesn't mean better life. Cheaper things doesn't mean better life. So what is better life? So that's actually what directed me to want to have those kind of conversations, especially with people. I want to ask a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
And I think if I could realize this, students can realize this too. Like I just got a student sitting in my office the other day that he got a really competitive, like not competitive, smart brother. Just like, he's a professor in some really good Ivy League school at like 26, 27, right? He's just working his butt off. He probably took a several years of detour, didn't work hard, but he's super smart. And I just brought him like 3 or 4 opportunities to work at a local really USGS, which is a really good company, and then some local startup companies. I was trying to set up him with Google. I said, well, you're so successful, but why are you so distressed? Why are you so stressful? Like every time I bring him new things, he feels even more sad. It's like good things are happening. You're picking between good and better. You're not picking between no job or some okay job. You're picking good and better. Why are you so upset?
But is he comparing himself to his brother?
Basically. So that's the problem. Just like if you just change the view a little bit, with the exactly same objective conditions,
Mhm.
like same job,
Yeah.
same place, same major, same everything, right? Your life can be better.
Yeah.
That's where I see how powerful that thing is, and I'm betting for that side, psychology could, science and technology could never give you that.
Yeah.
Right. So I kind of feel like I don't want to be the slave of science and technologies.
Mhm.
I want to conquer them.
Good for you.
Yeah, but that has to be from the human side.
Yeah, I appreciate hearing that. And you voice in a way. I think when I've talked about it, my shift was loving certainty, just in the sense that mathematics has certainty, right? I mean, it has it follows an
Even
algorithm.
with randomness, you can quantify it.
Right, but
Yeah.
same thing with biology, same thing with chemistry. You know, like if you're titrating something in chemistry, like you know, once you get past a certain level, you're gonna get this reaction or you're not. It's not. And I think, and I don't even, you know, there was like no moment in life, but at one point I made that shift from loving certainty to being curious about uncertainty. And at that time, that's kind of when I discovered psychology. It's like, wow, I really do kind of like this, like gray. And that's why I try to tell students, like, and I understand there's comfort in certainty, right? You know, many humans, we want to reduce uncertainty. But it's also pretty cool to sit in that gray area and try to kind of sort this stuff out. And I always use I say, if you just take the brain alone and the number of neurons and neuronal connections, there's more in that 8-pound thing than there are connections and stars in the known universe. And so if we're not even close to figuring this stuff out, and it's cool to be in it when it's still relatively young in its infancy. And even when we do apply science and technology to it to study it, it's not enough. It doesn't tell the whole story. There's still a lot of mystery in it. And that's some of the stuff that you were talking about, trying to understand and explain.
If you think about it, like, we cannot create anything that is similar to human. Like, you can clone, for example, mammals, but you clone it once you have the cell.
Right.
Can you just have water and all the chemical element and just build a cell from scratch?
Right.
No, you basically use whatever we have and regenerate from it, right?
Right,
But you
yeah.
could actually build it from scratch. That actually tells us how naive we are. Even just
Right.
building a cell, can you do it? Can you do it
Right.
from scratch? Not
Right.
really,
Not yet.
right?
No.
So yeah, that is interesting. Yeah,
Mhm.
I definitely see that side. That's why I kind of enjoy this conversation, because I feel like we're on the same page here, like shifting from technology
Yeah.
more towards the human side.
Yep.
Yeah. And I don't know. I was reading some philosophy it's called Tao Te Ching from China.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That was a really interesting one, because everything has a built-in how to say. Let's say this mouse here,
Mhm.
this keyboard here, they all have their built-in mechanics,
Mhm.
right? So if you're learning science, you know the mechanics. The mouse works this way, the flower works that way, the microphone works this way, right?
Mhm.
That's called Tao inside
Alright.
them. But human is the only thing that is different. That is, if everything is so certain,
Mhm.
then every human should behave the same way. But somehow, given the same situation, you throw a different human in. Sometimes
Right.
they do, like, what's your Tao? What's
Right,
your Tao? Like,
right.
what should human do in this situation? If it's a cat, I can totally predict. If it's a
Gotcha.
dog, I can totally predict. But if it's a human, I don't know. Anything can happen,
Right. I
right?
like
So that's
that.
actually the beauty of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really cool. I like that.
Okay. Well, we hit almost 2 hours. Thank you
Thanks
for
for
joining
doing
us
this.
today. That was fun.
Like your enthusiasm. I mean, I love what you're doing. So it was really an honor to spend this time with you.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.